Stuart, I'm excited to ask you this question. What is your definition of core stability? The reason I'm asking is I know there's very few labs in the world that have ever actually quantified this and measured it so they can say definitively this is what core stability is. And your lab is one of those labs that has done that. So what is your definition of core stability?
Just let me preface the answer by saying if you're an engineer and you're building a tall building that has to survive windstorms and hurricanes, or you're building a bridge that has to survive a certain amount of traffic, you have to know what the stability index is, because if you get it wrong, the structure will break and people are going to die. So that gives some real responsibility to the trainer now to truly understand what stability is, when it becomes low, and the exercises and the form of the exercise that they need to get that structure to be stable and have a high load-bearing ability. So it's all of that. But the 4 principles of core stability will go as follows. In order for me to walk, to move, to push or pull, you have to have proximal stiffness to create distal mobility. Think of a child who has a paralyzed quadratus lumborum at the neurological ward down the street at the Children's Hospital. Here is how they walk. If they have a paralyzed right QL, they take a step on the right leg, no problem, left leg, they collapse. So there's the gait pattern. You need proximal stability to even walk, because you can't hold the pelvic platform level to allow it. If you were going to run and cut, you had to have proximal stability to unleash the leg distal to the core. Otherwise, those muscles, they would bend your core, and you couldn't function. So proximal stiffness and stability is non-negotiable. You've got to have it to be a competent mover and spare the joints of this articulated linkage. The second principle is the spine is a flexible column. No engineer would build a tall, flexible column to bear load. But in order for us to dance and move around, we have a flexible spine, but it has to be stiffened, otherwise it will collapse. So in this particular model, we've shown, and this is how we would measure this form of stability, we've just put a wire down the middle of these vertebrae, basically. If the wire has tension, we'll put in a little bit of a low back lordotic curve, a little bit of a kyphotic thoracic curve, and that spine will bear load. I can perturb it, and because it has stiffness and the guy wire system of the obliques, rectus abdominis, quadratus, the erector spinae, that spine can now bear load. But if I take the load away, if I back off on the tone of all of these bracing muscles, and I'll just demonstrate that by releasing the thrust line compression by the wire, you'll see the whole structure collapse. So with a healthy spine, we can see it moving under control. It doesn't have much stiffness, but in order to bear load, we had to stiffen it down and stack the vertebra, otherwise it will just fly apart. So there's one role of creating the muscular guy wire system to allow it to bear load. In this particular model, we're creating the compression with the wire, so I'm just going to build a normal looking spine with some lumbar lordosis and thoracic kyphosis. It bears load, but if I take out the compressive thrust line provided by the guy wire system, it fails to bear load and it collapses. And that's exactly what happens when people fail to create enough bracing for a farmer's well. You have to brace. People say, well, how do I breathe? First of all, you better learn to sip air as you're gliding along carrying the implements. It's the only way you can create sufficient stability to allow that athletic tasks. So that's principle number 2, the guy wire system to allow that flexible rod to, when you're moving and dancing, you don't want much muscle tension. We've done one of the few studies on Middle Eastern dancers, and we watch the beautiful coordination to allow this movement. You can see I can dance very, very pathetically, but nonetheless, not one of those women could do a competent sit-up. They were that weak. So once again, they have magnificent mobility and low-end control. They had zero athletic ability when they're under load. So again, they became very specifically adapted to their style of training. If they then did a lot of strength training, I would strongly suspect they would injure their discs. You can't have it both ways, as we keep saying. Principle number 3, we've covered this, are micro movements. So people get pain triggers in their backs by little shear micro movements subsequent to mechanical change at a level due to a little bit of injury. And then they need to create a core bracing strategy to arrest the painful micro movements. Not too much and not too little, just tuned sufficiently to engineer out that pain trigger. Now the 4th element, and we start getting a bit more sports specific now, but you can imagine all of the combative sports, collision sports like rugby and football, you need a certain armor. And when you work with some of the martial artists, and they do tremendous amount of anterior abdominal wall work, that is to allow them to survive the punches and the kicks here and allow their viscera to survive the blows. But this is all, once again, part of the essential role of core stability. So when you measure it, we then are able to give advice on how trainers can tune the right amount of core stability to allow movement, unleash explosive athleticism, to bear heavy loads, and to survive collisions.